My name is Renata Pumarol. I'm the coordinator of international projects here at the People's Forum. The People's Forum is a movement incubator for working class communities and marginalized communities here in the States. We stand in solidarity with working class people from all over the world. And today we stand in solidarity with working class people of Venezuela. It's been an honor to put together this event. We are not only putting together this event so that you learn about sanctions, so that you learn the history. We want you to learn the history, but we also want you to walk out of here and take action against sanctions in Venezuela and beyond. We are putting this event not just to feel better about ourselves, we are putting this event for the people of Venezuela who are suffering under sanctions imposed by the United States government. And before we start the event, I wanted to make an announcement that unfortunately Mark Weisbrod could not be here with us today because of unforeseen circumstances. I know he really wanted to be here today. However, last minute, we put together an amazing panel, and I'm really excited, and I know we have an amazing set of panelists. So I will kick it off to Claudia to introduce them, and thank you so much for being here.
¿Cómo estamos? ¿Se ven bien? So my name is Claudia De la Cruz, and I'm one of the directors and part of the collective that put together the People's Forum, and it's a huge honor for me to be able to be in conversation and facilitate the conversation around sanctions, which so often get brushed off. You know, we hear the word and we usually don't understand the impact of sanctions on people's lives. We connect it to punishment, and we don't know who is being punished and why. And I think, you know, this conversation is primarily very much important because there's all sorts of attacks that have been waged against the people of Venezuela, the people that have stood with dignity to defend the revolutionary process that is theirs. It's the people's process. And so we are very glad to be able to host this conversation in the context of US governments waging war against the world. There are currently formally, and I'll say this, formally 13 countries that are under sanction by the United States of America. 13, formally, because there's other ways that informally the United States have found to attack governments and nations and people that are not aligning with them politically and economically. And so again, we're honored to be able to have folks that could share their experience and also share the knowledge of the impact on sanctions, particularly on the Bolivarian revolution, which is a people's revolution. So help me welcome Anya Parampil. Anya is a journalist with the Gray Zone. She's previously hosted a daily progressive afternoon news program called In Question on RT America. She has produced and reported several documentaries, including on the ground reports from the Korean Peninsula and Palestine. So welcome, Anya. We have Ben Becker, who is an anti-war organizing with the Answer Coalition, an editor of Liberation News, a monthly socialist newspaper. He has written extensively on Latin America and was a lead organizer for the March 16th Hands on Venezuela National March in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Ben. We also have Terry Madsen. Terry is the newest edition of Code Pink. With a focus on Venezuela, she led a multinational anti-sanctions campaign delegation to Venezuela in March and actually came back from a 3-month stay, and we'll be talking a little bit more about her experience in Venezuela. Welcome, Terry. And because special things happen on special days, we have a very special person here with us today. We have Samuel Moncada Costa, who is the ambassador to the UN, historian, and a friend of the house because he's been here more than once. So welcome back, Samuel. And so we're gonna get right into it. Anya, you are off to start us off.
Okay. Hello. How is everyone doing? Thank you so much for being here and making time out of your Tuesday to come listen to what I think is a very important issue and something that we can actually do something about as the US public. We need to have an awareness and resist not just the push for a military conflict with Venezuela, but also the economic war that is being waged on the country and has been for years now. Some of you might know I was recently inside of Venezuela's former embassy in Washington, D.C., as part of the embedded media covering the Embassy Protection Collective, which I'm sure many of you know was put together by a group of organizers, including Code Pink, the Answer Coalition, and Popular Resistance, to protect the grounds of Venezuela's diplomatic mission in Washington, D.C. from the illegal seizure and takeover carried out by the US government and by extension, Carlos Vecchio, Guaido's so-called ambassador to the United States. And what I learned being a part of that collective was a lot of what I already knew about how the US government functions, but the Embassy Protection Collective, the embassy specifically, now it's the former embassy, we should be clear about that, it became a transformed Georgetown in Washington, D.C., one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the country, into a front line in the diplomatic war that is being waged against Venezuela. The way I see it, there are 4 wars being waged. There's the diplomatic war, on which Ambassador Moncada fights every day in the United Nations and other institutions that are, such as the Organization for the American States, where they're trying to give this coup attempt legitimacy. There's an economic war, which we're going to talk about tonight. There is a media war, propaganda war. That's why when I was in Venezuela with my team at the Gray Zone and we were going to the stores and seeing that they were stocked, we were still seeing CNN reports claiming that you couldn't buy toothbrush and toothpaste in Venezuela, which was a lie. That's part of the media war. And then there's the constant threat of a hot military war and the involvement of the United States in funding paramilitary militias, right-wing groups in Colombia specifically, and making these threats constantly that an invasion or a war could take place. So those are the 4 fronts in the war. We're going to talk about the economic war. And at the Embassy Protection Collective, or during the Embassy Protection Collective, we experienced firsthand the tactics that the US government uses on the Venezuelan people in order to crush their revolution and their spirit. The collective became kind of a microcosm because when they couldn't get us out by asking or threatening, there was constantly a talk that they could come in and arrest, but there was not until the end the specific threat. And when they couldn't do that, in order to force the activists out, the first thing they did was shut off our access from the rest of the world, from the rest of Washington, D.C., by sending groups of right-wing Venezuelans some of them came up from Miami, some of them are there working at think tanks and for the weapons industry in Washington, D.C. They surrounded the entire building in order to cut us off, so we couldn't get food and we couldn't get water inside. I mean, it's exactly what they did to Venezuela. They try through sanctions to cut it off from the rest of the world. Then they had the right-wingers, the crazy right-wingers, acting extremely violent. People might not realize that even members of the collective from the outside, one of the allies that we had out there trying to deliver us food, couldn't go to work for a month afterwards because he was injured so badly by these right-wingers, these absolute gangster thugs. They were absolutely disgusting. I mean, they assaulted me when I tried to ask Vecchio a question. They used the N-word to describe black people. They were extremely homophobic, would constantly hurl slurs at people who they decided looked different. And this is exactly what, again, Venezuelans experience in their country, and it's to a far more extreme level through these guarimbas and the violent opposition protests that have taken place. They transplanted some of that into Washington, D.C. But it didn't work. Even though they cut off the food, they cut off water, they were terrorizing us all night, banging pots and pans until 10 p.m. every night, blaring air horns first thing in the morning, shining lights directly into the top floors so that we couldn't sleep. When none of that worked, just like when sanctions didn't work in Venezuela in terms of convincing the Venezuelan people to support regime change, what did they do to the embassy? They cut off the electricity. The US government might want to deny that it had anything to do with the power outages which took place in Venezuela earlier this year, but it was a very telling tactic that was exactly the line they went for, the electricity and the water. And in the end, how did they win? Because federal US agents raided the embassy and arrested 4 remaining embassy protectors inside: Adrian Pine, David Paul, Kevin Zeese, and Margaret Flowers. Extremely brave people who I was so inspired to work with. They were ready to go. They could have lasted another month or more inside of that embassy, and they were ready to do it. And what does that tell us again about the Venezuelan opposition? That they can't get the job done themselves. They need force, specifically force from the US government. It's the same thing that happened inside of that embassy. That is what the Venezuelan opposition wants to do in Venezuela, and that's the only way they'll win. Embassy grounds are supposed to be inviolable, according to the Vienna Diplomatic Convention. Carlos Vecchio, Guaido's ambassador, he actually signed a paper saying that if US agents damaged the property while they were inside, he wouldn't pursue any charges or punishment. That is exactly how they view their own country. They would say, open it up, we don't care who dies, we don't care how many people suffer, how many refugees are created, we just want to get in power again so that by extension, US capital and US industry can be in power again. When I got out of the embassy, I decided that I wanted to learn a little bit more about the characters that I had been encountering there, specifically Carlos Vecchio, because he was obviously driving the push in Washington, D.C., and he wasn't someone that we hear about typically as a popular face of the Venezuelan opposition. We hear about Leopoldo Lopez, we obviously hear about Guaido, but as I looked into Vecchio, I started to realize that through learning his story and telling his story, you learn everything you need to know about the Venezuelan opposition, and also that he had an extremely influential role, an important role, a misunderstood and overlooked role in pushing for this coup. I wrote about Carlos Vecchio for the Gray Zone in a piece that was released last week. It was quite extensive, but I'll just give you a summary. Carlos Vecchio tells people that he just entered politics when Chavez took over because he saw that his country was going to become a dictatorship. And that's a lie. The reality is Carlos Vecchio started out working pre-Chavez for PDVSA, the Venezuelan state oil company, which at that time had not been fully nationalized by Chavez. It was still open to private investment. And then he takes a job with Mobil before it merges with Exxon. So he's working for the oil industry up until '98 when Chavez takes power. Then he comes to the United States on a Fulbright scholarship, a State Department-funded scholarship, studies at Georgetown, studies at the Harvard Kennedy School, which also happens to be where Leopoldo Lopez went. And then he returns to Venezuela and immediately starts working with US-funded NGOs, non-government organizations. It's a strange term if they're all funded by the US government, but that's what they are. And he immediately is involved with the NGO class, In fact, his roommate, one of his good friends, while he was in Washington, D.C., someone he knew even before his time in D.C., set up the State Department's Office for Transitional Initiatives in Caracas in 2002 after the coup. This is the office that pumped millions over the years, pumped millions of dollars into opposition groups, NGOs like the ones Carlos Vecchio was working with. And guess what he's also doing? He's leading Exxon's legal fight against the Chavez government for the restructuring of the oil industry that Chavez enacted. So Vecchio is an oil industry figure first and foremost, and he only quits politics in 2007 when Exxon is forced out of the country by Chavez. And he's eventually forced to leave Venezuela because he had a major hand in the 2014 La Salida exit campaign, where Leopoldo Lopez, who Vecchio founded Voluntad Popular with, this is the main US-backed party in Venezuela. Vecchio founded that party with Leopoldo Lopez. They try to say now Guaido was involved in founding it, but he wasn't. He was a student that they picked up and brought into the party. It was Lopez and Vecchio, and these are the men who in 2014 he was on stage behind Lopez when Lopez made the call for protesters to go and march on the Attorney General's office in Caracas, and shortly after Lopez gave that order, activists, opposition rioters actually went and tried to burn the building down. So that's why he's forced to leave the country. Lopez is eventually under house arrest. When Vecchio gets to the United States, he immediately begins working with the US government to lay the groundwork for what would become the Trump administration coup. He writes about meeting with members of Congress, academics, people in the White House, and they, in March 2015, are successful in driving the Obama administration to classify Venezuela as a national security threat, signing that executive order in March 2015. And they make direct reference to the jailing of political prisoners, meaning Lopez, in that document. And that's what the Obama administration and subsequently the Trump administration uses to roll out and justify sanctions against Venezuela. And he also at that time runs a campaign at the OAS with Luis Almagro, the former Uruguayan foreign minister who's come into power, and they create a report based on Vecchio and his contacts, which Almagro delivers in May 2015, to invoke the Inter-American Democratic Charter at the Organization for the American States, which is a charter meant to handle states which, quote, seriously impair the democratic order. That is what prompts Venezuela to begin the process of exiting the Organization for the American States, because it became very obvious who controlled that organization at that point. It's no longer the OAS, it's the Organization of the United States. Just like many of these institutions, the United States wields disproportionate power. Over this time, the sanctions begin to have an impact, and we're told this lie that sanctions only target the government. That's what we started hearing the Obama administration say. But the reality is these sanctions made it impossible for Venezuela to pay its debt. And so immediately it begins defaulting on payments in the West, and then that gives Western credit institutions like S&P the pretext to downgrade Venezuela, make it seem as though Maduro is just so incompetent that he can't pay his bills, and as a result, create this scenario where Venezuela can't restructure its debt, can't pay its debt, can't do anything that other countries are simply just allowed to do. So the sanctions begin to have an impact. We begin to feel the development of an economic crisis in Venezuela, also, of course, impacted by the fall in oil prices in 2014. And eventually the Trump administration comes into power, and Trump appoints none other than Mr. John Bolton to be his national security advisor. Last fall, Bolton gave his Troika of Tyranny address when he named Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela as the Troika of Tyranny. And it's funny because actually when President Bush gave his State of the Union in 2002, the famous Axis of Evil speech, Bush initially named North Korea, Iraq, and Iran as the axis of evil. And then the next day at the State Department, there was another speech given expanding that list to include Libya, Syria, Cuba. Guess who gave that speech? John Bolton, when he was Under Secretary of State. So the Troika of Tyranny is an extension of the axis of evil. And why? It's a regime change list. They were openly naming the countries that they wanted to carry out regime change. And it's not a coincidence that Syria, Libya, Iraq, they all fell under this agenda. They also tell us that sanctions are supposed to encourage negotiation, right? That's what they say. They want to put pressure on the Maduro government so that they will come and have some sort of conversation. Well, then why then, earlier this year, did the US Treasury Department sanction Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza of Venezuela, the top diplomat of the country? Does that sound like the kind of sanction that's going to encourage dialogue? Or if you're sanctioning your partner at the table, you're essentially telling them you're not interested in dialogue, you're only interested in regime change. The Trump administration escalated the sanctions this year when they specifically targeted Venezuela's oil industry and froze $7 billion worth of Venezuelan assets held in the United States. And the US actually bragged about the impact these sanctions have had. On the State Department's website, they published a list about US objectives and policy in Venezuela. And they deleted it within, a day? Because they knew it was stuff that they shouldn't be admitting to or portraying in a positive light. It included the fact that Venezuela couldn't sell oil or gold, and that 25 million barrels of Venezuela's crude is stranded off the coast with nowhere to go because of sanctions. They were bragging about crushing Venezuela's economy. And I should mention at the top of that list, US policy accomplishments in Venezuela. What was number one? Juan Guaido declares himself interim president. What does that tell you about Juan Guaido? It's just an organic people's uprising, right? It doesn't really make sense then that is the outcome of US policy. When this list, which I interviewed Ambassador Moncada at the time, and he described it as a confessions list, which is what it essentially was, I wrote an article about it at the Gray Zone and I interviewed Mark Weisbrot, because he had just released a report at the Center for Economic and Policy Research documenting 40,000 deaths, preventable deaths, which took place over the course of just 1 year in Venezuela because of these sanctions. And so what Mark told me is, he said, if I were the State Department, I wouldn't brag about causing a cut in oil production. This means even more premature deaths than the tens of thousands that resulted from sanctions last year. The US is not ashamed to admit that its policy is resulting in the suffering of Venezuelans. But there's another aspect to the sanctions that I've only recently become more aware of through my work, and that is to provide cover for the literal theft of Venezuela's assets in the United States. And I can explain by returning to Carlos Vecchio, Mr. Exxon, because he, when he was asked earlier this year what he can do in the United States, considering he doesn't have a foreign ministry, and at the time didn't even have something he could call an embassy, and the answer he gave to PRI, Public Radio International, was bank accounts. We have bank accounts that belong to the Venezuelan government, and I represent the Venezuelan government, and I can, it is our job to protect those accounts and the Citgo accounts and the gold that's all here. Very strange answer for an ambassador to give. What are you going to do here? Oh, I'm going to meet with the president and advocate peace between my two nations is maybe an answer you would expect. But no, not Carlos Vecchio, especially because he sent his staff to a meeting in Washington, D.C. at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a oil, financial industry, and U.S. government-funded think tank. And the title of that event was Military Options, Assessing Military Options for Venezuela. Max Blumenthal, my colleague and friend at the Gray Zone, reported on that story. That's not something an ambassador does, because apparently he's working with the bank accounts. So again, what does that tell me? It tells me the coup regime here has actually been given some of those accounts. And something else the Guaido administration moved to do very quickly was name a new board to PDVSA and Citgo, the two companies which oversee Venezuela's oil production. And even at the time, in January or February when this happened, Bloomberg magazine mocked this idea because they said, how can you just replace the board of a corporation? These people don't actually control anything on the ground in terms of oil production in Venezuela. So what is the purpose of assigning 10 random people sitting in the United States the title of board of Citgo and PDVSA? It was to transfer the accounts to them. What else? And the woman that they appointed to lead Citgo, Luisa Palacios, she, before she was doing this, was working for a premier consulting firm for top hedge funds and investment banks all over the world. She was specifically charged with analyzing Latin America energy policy. Now she's in charge of a Latin American-based energy company. That to me sounds very corrupt. She also was a World Bank advisor and investment bank advisor, so that's who they put in charge. Who else do they put in charge? They put in this man, Andres Eloy Padilla. He's a financial analyst who was appointed by his brother, who is in the Energy Committee in the legally defunct opposition-controlled Venezuelan parliament. Two other board members, Luis Urdaneta and Angel Omeda, they were former PDVSA and Citgo employees, top-level executives, vice president, chief operating officer of PDVSA. They left the company in '98 when Chavez took over. So these are the people who they've put in charge of Citgo. They just transferred the wealth that Venezuela had here back into the hands of the people who had it before the revolution and have been dying to get their hands on it ever since. So that's why I say these sanctions have provided cover for a theft, a massive transfer of wealth. And I would like to know, just to wrap, the questions that I'm going to be focusing on going forward. I want to know who is paying Vecchio, who is paying Carlos Vecchio, and he has a staff of dozens of men in Washington, D.C., who I've encountered at the embassy and at the Organization for American States. They have a shadow government here. They don't have one in Venezuela because they can't get power there, but they have a shadow government here. And they're living in Washington, D.C., some of them. I think Vecchio is still living in Miami. But how are they paying for their apartments? How are they living their lives? They're not working at those cushy think tank jobs anymore. I would like to know if they're not using that stolen money. It seems like a very simple question because they say, Vecchio's words were, it's the Venezuelan government's money, I represent that. So they seem to be justifying this. And I'll just close by saying, as we should go forward asking those questions and be aware of this theft, because it should be a huge scandal. I would think even some mainstream reporters, and you might be surprised to hear me say this, but I think even some mainstream reporters would want to crack that case. Where did this money go? And are these people living off stolen wealth? The last thing I learned in the embassy was that not only is this how my government functions through bullying, thuggery, and violence, but also the minute any one of us as US citizens stands up to resist it, they will just as quickly use the tactics they employ to pillage and destroy countries abroad on you and us and the people here. We're the same in their eyes, And that's why I always say, you, me, the people in this room, we have more in common with the people of Venezuela than we do with the government that represents us, claims to represent us, which is funded by the same corporations which want to get their hands in Venezuela once again, and the same corporations which fund the Venezuelan opposition. So we have to be very aware of that and continue. I mean, the work of Code Pink and Answer, I'm just so happy and grateful for, because the marches that we've been having in Washington, D.C., the Embassy Protection Collective, these kinds of things are those are the ways that we can change power. I know that through the Embassy Protection Collective, we were making Elliot Abrams personally upset, and that felt pretty good. But we have to be creative and think of other ways that we can directly hit the empire and continue to resist it. Thank you.
Hello. Well, first, I want to thank the People's Forum for the invitation here, and thank you all for coming. And thank you to Ambassador Samuel Moncada for making time in his, I'm sure, very busy and complicated day's work to be with us here. In 1915, there was a revolt in Haiti in which the US-backed dictator was targeted by an uprising. And at that time, the US government, led by the Klansman Woodrow Wilson, immediately intervened. And they sent Marines into Haiti without really hardly any pause, as they did many times throughout Latin America. And they said, to reestablish peace and order. But of course, what all of the historical record has shown is that it was transparently actually to preserve US financial and economic interests. And in Port-au-Prince, they seized the entire gold reserves of the people of Haiti and took it back to Washington with them. The entire gold, they just emptied it out the vaults and left. Complete international piracy. If that were to happen in 2019, that would be a big scandal, because you're not supposed to go into countries, banks, and steal all of their national wealth, which was accumulated from the labor and the toil of generations of workers. But that is what's happened with Venezuela. And of course, they didn't send the Marines in to do it. They just did it digitally. They froze the accounts of the gold reserves that are being held in Europe, and I believe here some in the United States, but I think fundamentally in Europe. And they just said, this gold no longer is under your authority, under your discretion, and we're instead going to give it to folks like Carlos Vecchio. So we should respond with the same level of outrage as we would if 104 years ago the US Marines went and seized the national wealth of a sovereign country. We should react that way today. But it is a buried story. It's not even on the headlines of most national newspapers. And people also, when they hear about a frozen bank account, that doesn't exactly sound like an international war crime. It doesn't sound like warfare at all, but it is warfare. And it's important also because when we throw out these big numbers, $9 billion in gold reserves, $5 billion net worth of Citgo. I mean, I don't think we have any billionaires in the room, so we hear about billions and we think, oh, billions, it's like that. Those numbers are so large that they don't really, they're hard to grasp, right? None of us are budgeting numbers like that. But the government of Venezuela is budgeting numbers like that. And those numbers are the exact numbers they need to import the necessary food and medicine to sustain the population. And that doesn't just derive from the Bolivarian Revolution, but the long history of Venezuela has an economy that was structured around oil sales and using the revenue from oil sales to purchase the things that were necessary to live: food, medicine, technology, other basic supplies. Those were not there wasn't a local manufacturing or agricultural sector sufficient to sustain the entire population. So when you start seizing billions of dollars, that means you're directly saying Venezuela cannot provide for its people, and those people will suffer. And I don't know how many people have seen Mark Weisbrot and Jeffrey Sachs' report. How many people have read that report? Okay, that's a pretty good number. Everyone needs to read the report. That should be required reading. And I think they printed it out here at the People's Forum. So maybe people can take them on the way out or something. But that report says there's 40,000 deaths that have happened on account of sanctions since 2017. The August 2017 sanctions, as Anya said, made it impossible for Venezuela to access US financial markets. And US financial markets are the heart of the global financial system. And then the January 2019 sanctions cut off all US oil purchases from Venezuela. And even despite all the political and ideological conflict between the US and Venezuela, the US represented over a third of Venezuelan oil sales. So you're talking about the #1 source of revenue for a government and sinking it almost to zero or as much as possible. It's very similar to the type of strangulation that the US has attempted against the revolutionary government of Cuba for the last 6 decades. I think many activists here are familiar with the techniques and the methods of the US blockade of Cuba. The Helms-Burton Law, many other types of sanctions that have been used. For instance, if you're a company that does business in Cuba that's taking place on land or property that was taken from the Cuban government in 1959, then your company can be sued by the descendants of the Cuban owner from the 1950s in US courts. And of course, they'll get summary judgments from any US judge saying so that makes it very hard for any businesses to open up in Cuba. We need to familiarize ourselves with the new methods of how they're waging war against Venezuela, because they're not identical methods, but the objective is just as crippling. And for the 40,000 who have died, of course, there's probably 10 or 100 times as many people whose lives have been directly affected, many, many times more. People who can't now access insulin, people with hypertension who can't access insulin, people with HIV who can't receive medicine for that. The caloric intake of the Venezuelan people has been reduced. The amount of food that can get into the bellies of children has been impacted by these sanctions. That's how we have to describe these sanctions, not as technological, sort of technocratic ways of avoiding warfare. This is violent warfare in the sense that it's having a physical impact on an entire population. I want to just, I think, lay out a little bit of the sort of strategic context in which all this is happening, because I think for an anti-war movement to emerge, again, as a powerful force in the United States, that's necessary. We have to sort of situate ourselves and understand what's sort of behind the headlines. We can't underestimate the importance of the Bolivarian Revolution, which really radicalized after 2002 when the people overthrew the US-backed coup. The Bolivarian Revolution for this whole last period of global history has been like a beacon of light in which counter-revolution was the norm. And you could take that back to the 1970s and 1980s, the Reagan years. Of course, there was resistance and revolutionary upsurges in places like Central America, but the general norm of the last 35, 40 years has been counter-revolution. The period from World War II to the late 1970s, it was revolution, anti-colonial revolution, socialist revolution, national liberation struggles. But in this whole neoliberal era since really the opening of China to the present, it's been very hard for working class people, oppressed people to secure victories and make revolutionary triumphs. Venezuela really stood out as something different that was happening. And it started in a kind of unlikely place, and maybe for an unlikely person. People in the left didn't even know about Hugo Chavez that much. But once he was in there, he made a huge difference in mobilizing the people and raising a socialist horizon for the Bolivarian Revolution. It started as really an anti-imperialist, anti-neoliberal revolution, and it grew into a socialist revolution, a socialist horizon. And from Venezuela, that began to impact all of Latin America, Bolivia, Ecuador, Brazil, Argentina. Not every country had the same horizon. There's an activist in Argentina who I had the pleasure of meeting here, Manuel Bertoldi, is that right? That's his name, from Patria Grande, a very important organization in Argentina. And he described that in the previous historical period, there have been 3 different projects in Latin America. What he called the neoliberal project, I think we're all familiar with that. That's austerity, cutbacks, increasing the rate of exploitation, the theft of natural resources, the right-wing governments. That's one project, the neoliberal project. Second, there was what he called the neo-developmental project, which was not as radical as, for instance, Venezuela, Cuba, did not have a socialist horizon. The neo-developmental project, as exemplified maybe in Brazil, Argentina, to some extent Ecuador, they were trying to work with the US led economic system, trying to build a cross-class alliance, but also to share more of the income and the economic growth with the poor. And then the third project was ALBA, the Bolivarian alternative for the people of Latin America. And ALBA really did have a socialist horizon, with Cuba and Venezuela as the anchors. And if you look at the last 10 years, starting under the Obama administration, not the Trump administration, they've been turning back to Latin America, what they call their backyard, the historic backyard. That's why Woodrow Wilson was able to go in 1915, because he saw Latin America as the extended territory of the United States. This was the Monroe Doctrine. And starting in 2009, they overthrow Manuel Zelaya in Honduras. In 2012, there's a form of a coup against the Paraguayan president. There's a judicial coup against Dilma, and now to prevent Lula from running. They've been tightening the screws on all of Latin America, something they couldn't do when they were bogged down in the Middle East. But now that they've been able to pull their forces out of the Middle East somewhat, they're again turning back to Latin America. So that's the crown jewel, the holy grail for them is, can they overturn the Venezuelan revolution? And for them, going after Venezuela is a part of a larger strategy to recapture all of Latin America, to go after Cuba, to go after Nicaragua, and we should understand all of these processes as fundamentally interlinked. I want to close by speaking about this notion of the new forms of warfare, because the US empire has a fundamental contradiction, and that is that they operate on the basis of pure power, military might. They like to claim that the US leadership in the world is based on values, but of course people of the world fundamentally reject the values of the United States and generally hate its government, not its people, but generally hate its government. The US empire is backed up on pure force, 800 bases, the projection of power across all of the lands and seas of the world. And yet at the same time, every time they directly intervene with those military forces, they face an increasing anti-war sentiment in the United States, which is a political factor in their equation, in their thinking, in their calculations, and they face even wider rejection from the peoples of the world. So how do you preserve an empire which is based on military power, and that military power protecting all these complex financial institutions? How do you do that if you can't so clearly intervene as you used to be able to? The US military has this sort of concept of the demonstration effect. Why did they really attack Afghanistan? Was Afghanistan a threat to the United States? No. why did they really attack Iraq? I mean, it's true they have resources that are important, but it's also important that they have to be continuously showing to potential rivals, other imperialist countries like in Western Europe, and also other independent countries, that we are not afraid to use our military power. But now they've reached the new stage where they're pulling back from that type of military intervention, or at least they're showing a lot of hesitation. So they've developed much more sophisticated forms of hybrid war, dirty wars, sanctions, dark ops, cyber war. We have to really study this, because this is the essence of modern warfare. The question of war and peace, which I think all of us can say, well, we're for peace, not for war, that has been fundamentally shifted in this current stage of imperialism. Economic sanctions is the new tactic of choice for the US ruling class. And for an anti-war movement to emerge, we can't just be thinking in that same way about we're against bombers and we're against troops. We have to make sanctions the heart of what we're agitating around. And no politician who says they're for sanctions, not war, is a friend of the anti-war movement. That is a pro-war politician. They shouldn't be given a pass. If they say we're for these forms of strangling independent people, but not these more overt forms, which would land photos on the cover of the newspaper, that is not a friend. That is a deceiver who's come to actually pull the wool over your eyes. So the anti-war movement has to get very principled, get very smart, and we have to really ask these politicians, if you're anti-war, what's your position on sanctions? Thank you.
Okay, I've got two tough speeches to follow here. So there's a couple things I want to comment on that Anya and Ben both said before I talk a little bit about my personal experience in Venezuela. Earlier this year, I was there for 3 months after leading an anti-sanctions delegation. The first thing is, Ben, you mentioned ALBA and the whole threading the needle, the creation of ALBA, and I think it's really important this week to understand the United States' hatred for ALBA. June 28th marks the 10th anniversary of the coup in Honduras, and Honduras was on the verge of joining ALBA prior to Zelaya being removed from office. And so I think we can all understand how strong the United States feels about that particular organization. And so I just want to honor that fact that June 28th is the 10th anniversary. And also we've done a lot of talking. And also we've done a lot of talking tonight about transfer of wealth, concentration of wealth, natural resource grabbing. And the last time I was here, and Ambassador Moncada, you were as well, was during opening week of the UNGA 2018. And one of the major themes in the opening speeches that week that we heard throughout, through many countries, large and small, was a real dialogue between, not dialogue, that's the wrong way to put it, controversy, I guess is better. Those countries that clearly believe in multilateralism, large and small, and those countries, principally the United States, Honduras, and Ukraine, that believe in unilateralism. And I would argue one of the biggest issues, ideas, economic theories that Chavez did promote in expanding economic freedom throughout Latin America was this promotion of multilateralism. And I do think that's one of the largest factors that the US disagrees with Venezuela and others in the region, in the hemisphere. So that's just my brief comments on those two issues that came up. I also think one of, regarding sanctions specifically, and us as US citizens, we basically are victims of a 20-year US media coup against Venezuela. And we as a population have been really treated with a very specific narrative against Venezuela that's been going on for 20 years and is really hard to crack. And Anya, you and your compatriots in journalism have a tough job at that. But we are conditioned to thinking that warfare, and Ben, you touched on this too, that warfare is equivalent to boots on the ground or the US dropping bombs. Of course, we're not doing any of that yet in Venezuela. Sanctions are equally as crippling, if not more so, and again, we'll refer to the CEPR report that Mark and Jeffrey produced. And so that's what I would like to talk to you about, is what it is like to live day to day in Venezuela, and some of my personal experiences. I have two things that I'm involved in at this point. Clearly, you can see I'm with Code Pink, and I'm very proud to say that I'm a recent activist. As of a week now, I've been active with them in a less formal role, but now in a quite formal role, living in Washington, D.C. now. So one of the things that I've been doing is taking delegations to Venezuela over the last 10 years. I think it's really important for US citizens specifically, and I would now argue Canadians as well, and other nations, but North America specifically, to go and see on the ground what it's like in Venezuela, and not only to experience Venezuela, but to bring that experience back to North America. Because there is a huge media narrative that needs to be broken, and that can be done through events like this. So I took a group of 14 people to Venezuela in March, right after the national blackout. And we were there to study the sanctions, and we lived through several days without electricity, without running water. We spent the majority of our time in Caracas, but we did go west to Lara State and spent some time in Barquisimeto, which is the 4th largest city in Venezuela. And I will tell you, unanimously, all 14 of us responded immediately to the energy on the ground in Venezuela. People are still friendly, people still speak with you, people will help you do pretty much anything. And that is so antithetical to what we're hearing here. And I really cannot stress enough the resilience of the Venezuelan people right now, all of you. It's really, that makes me very teary-eyed. I mean, it's profound. And I think that it needs to be said, and I would encourage all of you to go and experience it. Despite everything that has been thrown at this nation and its people, the people still smile, they still talk to one another on the streets, they still get in line for the bus and go to work every day, they get their kids up in the morning, feed them breakfast, get them clothed and send them to school. There is quite a normal life in Venezuela day to day. It is not easy to navigate a normal day as we would define it here in the States, but people are doing it, and it is a profound thing to witness. So after our delegation, I chose to stay, and I lived in Caracas in a politically mixed working class neighborhood. And I really want to stress the politically mixed demographic I was living among. Most of us tend to think wealthy people, anti-Chavistas, opposition folks are on the east side of the city, and all the Chavistas are on the west side of the city. I was living among working class opposition people, predominantly. The household I was in was definitively Chavista, and I was there by choice. But it was very fascinating to live among opposition people. But mind you, these were working class opposition people who had absolutely nothing in common with stand-up President Guaido, and they were quite overt in conversation that they would never vote for him because they do not have anything in common with him or that 1% of wealthy capitalists that he represents. So I wanted to just share, and then we maybe can go to Q&A, so that two specific experiences that I had. The household I lived in, I did not pay rent. My deal, so to speak, with the family I was living with was for me to buy the groceries. And I could do this with US dollars, whereas they could not. And let me just say a little something about US dollars, and Samuel, you can correct me, but I was in Venezuela twice last year, March and then May. And what I saw last year compared to this year compared to last, was I was able to use small currency, 1s and 5s, on the street, in restaurants, in stores, readily. There was no question about whether they could be, used to purchase. And I would argue that that's a very insidious form of dollarizing the economy. The US, to a certain level, has succeeded with the sanctions, with creating hyperinflation, in forcing this insidious dribble of US dollars into the economy. And so this did lead to me buying the groceries for the household. Semana Santa, I went grocery shopping in, there was very little open because it was, huge holiday season, and people in Venezuela do honor their holidays, and it's not like where I'm from originally in the Silicon Valley where you work 24/7 regardless of day or week or time of year. They actually have family and friends and celebrate holidays and celebrate their lives. So I ended up going grocery shopping in Colonia San Bernardino. And this was fairly upper middle class, again, mixed politically. I found this, what was open on what's known as Holy Saturday, the Saturday right before Easter, was a lovely market in a mixed-use building. I would say mixed residential on the upper floors, and this beautiful market on the ground floor. This market was comparable to something you would see in Midtown Manhattan, or say in the Marina District in San Francisco. It was small, but beautifully packed and organized with pretty much every food product you could imagine. So I went in with a friend of mine, and we went to the butcher section, and we picked out a fresh whole chicken. The fresh whole chicken was raised in Venezuela. And then we got 6 beef patties. The beef was from Venezuela. And then we also bought a frozen pork loin that was frozen, that was imported. We bought at the deli section, a beautiful deli counter, we bought a 1/4 pound of sliced ham for sandwiches. The ham was imported. We bought a 1/4 pound of sliced white cheese. The cheese was produced in Venezuela. I want you to clearly understand how much food is being produced in Venezuela. Not to the volume that we would all like to see, but there is more and more food products being produced domestically, and I think that's really important for all of you to know. We bought a flat of eggs. The flat of eggs was 15. The eggs were produced in Venezuela. The eggs, I have to say, when I arrived in mid-March, the drive from the airport into the center of Venezuela, I noticed a number of changes, improvements, things for the better that I had seen over last year. And one of the things was this presence of eggs. Now, we bought a flat of 15 on Holy Saturday on this grocery shopping run, but you see eggs now, and this again is a change over last year. Eggs are a predominant source of protein in stores and in street markets. And it's a more affordable form of protein, and it's readily available. It's still expensive, but it is far less expensive than some of the things that we were buying on this particular Saturday. And so what else did we buy? We bought a loaf of bread that was produced in Venezuela. We bought all our fresh vegetables and fruit. All our fresh produce was bought at the same grocery store. All was produced in Venezuela. We bought a liter of orange juice that was produced there. We bought a gallon of water, and we bought a lot of small snacks like galletas and chips, papas fritas, and all of those were produced in Venezuela. So that grocery list that I just read off to you and that we purchased was $36 US. Now, where I come from in San Francisco, it would probably be about $200, particularly including all the meat items we did. So you think, okay, that's what 36 US bought. But you have to keep in mind the household I was living in, $36 was 3.5 months' income. So my point in sharing this with you is that it's not that there is not a lack of food, goods, and well, even hygiene, personal hygiene products. It's the access, and the access is controlled by predominantly the private sector. 80% of the Venezuelan economy is still privately owned. And so you can see how these items are being used against the people. So no matter how much the government continues to raise wages, the private sector will continue to raise prices. So the government's good, intention of creating more buying power for people is terrific, but the private sector does not allow that. And so the sanctions are working from inside and outside of the country, in my observation. But still, I have to say, no matter what household you walk into, people will always offer you something to eat and drink. And I think that is a real statement and tribute to the Venezuelan people and their culture. There is always something to offer you. So that was our grocery shopping experience. And then I had an interesting phone conversation. I called home from the house I was living in. You should know there is Wi-Fi and cellular data in Venezuela. It does exist, and it's quite usable. And there did not appear to be any sort of government censorship and access to it and surfing the internet. But I called home on Mother's Day, and it was about 10 o'clock in the morning, and I was sitting out front of the house that I was living in, and had a good conversation with my mom, and all of a sudden she started hearing a lot of background noise on the phone conversation, a lot of laughter and some kids kicking around a soccer ball and chasing each other and doing normal kid things. My mom stopped in the middle of the conversation and she said, "Well, what's that?" And I said, what do you mean, what's that? She said, "Well, all that noise in the background." And I said, "Well, kids playing. That's all the neighborhood kids playing." Now, I'm in a politically mixed neighborhood, and all the kids from all the different households were out in the middle of the street playing despite family politics. My mother was pleasantly surprised that there were so many kids out playing in the neighborhood, because what we are so conditioned to hearing in the United States is that Venezuela is on the verge of a civil war, that it's a war zone, that things are so horrible there. Here we had on Sunday kids out, and I would say every day after school because I lived there, but this particular Sunday it was quite animated play, and so much so that my mother heard it in the background on our phone conversation. And I just think that's just a really good example to share with you that there is normal life going on throughout most of the country, and it's such an antithetical thing to share back here in the States because of this 20-year media coup against the country. Let me just tell you a couple things that I'd like to encourage you all to do before we can. The first thing that I would ask all of you is to contact your Congress person and encourage them to sign and then pass on the floor HR 1004, which is no military intervention in Venezuela without congressional approval. Of course, we want to say no intervention, period. But let's at least get Congress to agree to that and pass that bill. Also, we had a really great project come out of the San Francisco Bay Area about 2 weeks ago. The city of Berkeley passed a resolution for no U.S. military intervention in Venezuela and to lift the sanctions. And so this is another project that can be done with activists in your local communities and to influence, your own municipalities. There is a sample of that resolution on an activist toolbox that has come out of the campaign to end U.S. and Canada sanctions against Venezuela, which is also, by the way, the group that I took the delegation down to Venezuela with in March. We've created an activist toolbox, and a sample resolution is in that toolbox, along with a lot of other resource documents to help educate your neighbors and friends about sanctions. And so that toolbox can be found at afgj.org, and it's going to be at codepink.org as well. So those are a few things that you can easily do now. And then just come with us and see the country and the people.
So just to wrap up the panel presentations, we want to be able to have some words from the ambassador. We would like to welcome him again and for taking some time to be with us today.
Good evening. Thank you very much for attending this invitation to talk about Venezuela. I wasn't expecting to speak, so I haven't got anything structured to say now, but I'm going to say a few words based on what I heard, which is very, very interesting and sparked a lot of new interesting ideas. Let me just, because I am a historian, I got this bias. Let's begin with this Klansman, really impressed me, Klansman, Woodrow Wilson. I didn't know that until a couple of years ago. I always thought of Woodrow Wilson as the man who made peace in Europe and proposed the peace plan and the Society of the Nation, yes. And then I knew that the man here was was an admirer of the birth of the nation, this Ku Klux Klan film, and he was absolutely racist. I was impressed with the difference between Woodrow Wilson abroad and Woodrow Wilson in Europe, because Woodrow Wilson in the Caribbean, in Latin America, is what you said, the man who invaded Haiti. But he also hated the South and the African Americans. Interesting. Well, it's the same kind of schizophrenic, bipolar, different personalities that you find here in the history of the United States. I mean, you can find so pro-war people in the Democratic Party, and even I watch her in the evening. This lady that speaks at the MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, a progressive person here, anti-Trump, and then she was defending Bolton because he didn't attack, Trump didn't follow his advice to attack Venezuela. Bolton was proposing, we need to go in, and Trump was saying to the Washington Post, or whoever was leaking, no, let's think that again. And Rachel Maddow was saying Trump is a bad man because he didn't follow his own man, Bolton. It's incredible. So she is the progressive person here. And then you saw on the other side, the guy from the Fox News who's talking. Then he's an incredible, that man I always thought, well, he still is a racist, anti-immigrant, all of it. And then he said, we don't need to go in Venezuela, we don't need to go in Iran. I spoke to the president, I advised him not to invade. You see, these kind of crazy things. I never expect them in my life to see that, but I am seeing that. And what I found, I knew that years ago, that there is no Democrats and Republicans. There are pro-war and anti-war people on both sides. It's very interesting. The war party. the war party, and even I saw one Republican representative from the north of Florida, I can't remember exact district, and his district has some marine base or whatever, people who would invade Venezuela if they are ordered to, and he was speaking to Trump, please don't go into Venezuela because my people is going to suffer. It's interesting to see that. I wasn't expecting that as well. But my point is that, as it has been said here, sanctions are violent, and sanctions are a war by other means. And sanctions provoke suffering, and sanctions are the new kind of, there are so many names for it, hybrid, unconventional, low profile, all kind of wars, but it's war. And they realize that they are provoking suffering, and they are trying to implode Venezuela and any country under sanctions from within. And then if they have the chance to go in militarily, they would go in militarily. And what I want to tell you is that there are not two extreme sanctions and war, or boots on the ground, as it's been said. There is a spectrum of choices, is some kind of menu, and there is a continuum. They are not isolated from each other. There is a continuum. You can upgrade from one level of sanctions to another, and then from one level of sanctions to sabotage. For example, when we said on the 7th of March that we were suffering a cyber attack which provoked a blackout that we had never before in our history had, 7 days blackout nationally. And when we said that we were under a cyber attack, people laughed at us. And then you began to see things like there is a malware program taken from the NSA, that people in Baltimore are threatening the grid there, the power electricity companies, that they don't pay, if they don't pay some ransom, I don't know how much, they will produce a blackout in Baltimore because they got the software to do it. And they took the software from the NSA. It's a public news. I don't know if you have read it or not, but it's there in the news. I'm not making it up. And then you see that the United States says, the government states that they also have the cyber weapons, and they have even a cyber command prepared to do the same in Russia if it's necessary. So they have the weapons to do it. And then you see that something happened in Argentina. I can't explain what happened in Argentina, but something unusual never happened something like that in Argentina. Someone was practicing there. But my point is that now, is it more believable or not that we were under a cyber attack? The very same morning of the 7th of March, we were remembering that a couple of days ago, the very same, because we were trying to reconstruct the whole thing, the very same morning of the 7th of March, there was a hearing in Congress, and Mr. Marco Rubio said, Venezuela is about to suffer a level of unprecedented suffering, exactly, as never any other country has gone through in this hemisphere, never ever. And then in the afternoon the blackout began. I mean, he announced it. But it's not coincidence. My point is that these kind of sanctions, I'm not going to go into the details, they are here, the details of the banks and amounts and measures, and Obama began, and then Trump increased the intensity and the frequency of them. They are part of a strategy. I was told that in Washington there is this framework of thinking that they say that there are two schools of thoughts. First, sanctions work, allow sanctions to work, just increase the level of sanctions, the intensity of them, and wait out, let them work. At the end, you're going to have perhaps longer than you were expecting, but you're going to have the end result, the result you were expecting to have. And the other said, no, sanctions don't work. They take too long. The target is not carved in the exact way. The target is not precise, accurate. We are making suffering, provoking suffering to so many millions of people. We want to destroy that easy. Let's go for other measures. Measures meaning black ops, sabotage, paramilitaries in Colombia. The noise with Colombia is increasing, and it's been like so for the last 4 months. They are being accused in Venezuela, and now at the OAS General Assembly, this weekend, or in 2 or 3 days' time, it began today, they are going to make a feast on Venezuela, accusing Venezuela of, let me give you a list. They said that Venezuela is a nest for Hezbollah. And then it's interesting this thing, because I began with this because it's so stupid. They are called the minister. In Britain it's complicated because the minister is the deputy minister. The actual minister is the secretary, like here, and then what they call the minister is the deputy minister for Latin America. The British deputy minister for Latin America is called the minister for Latin America. Alan Duncan, he doesn't like us at all. But he was asked in Parliament if what was the evidence of Hezbollah in Venezuela, and he says we have none. I mean, the British intelligence services are working in Venezuela. Of course, and they have known, he said so. That was the best chance for him to say yes, that Venezuela is part of the Hezbollah conspiracy, but he said no, we have known. But my point is, they said Hezbollah, they say Iran, they say Russia, they say China, they say Cuba, they say FARC, even though FARC has signed a peace agreement with the Colombian government, which is, by the way, destroying the whole peace process, and the war in Colombia is beginning once again. This is really, really dramatic and terrible events, but the war in Colombia is rekindling, and both parties are rearming and preparing for another wave of war, and they are trying to imply Venezuela in it. They are saying now that the ELN, which is the bigger guerrilla movement, has thousands of operatives of guerrilla troops in Venezuela, that 15,000 Venezuelans are now part of the ELN, that the ELN controls half of Venezuela, that the ELN is the rear guard of Venezuela is the rear guard of the ELN army, and even more, that the ELN is the last one, that the ELN is a paramilitary branch of the Venezuelan army. And even more, let me say, this is delicate, I'm going to go in this because it's very important. They are creating the narrative that Venezuela is such a danger that needs to be invaded for the protection of the whole hemisphere. So Colombia is saying that Venezuela is so dangerous because all the things I've said already, but then they also said that Venezuela is training ELN operatives with manpads, they call rocket launchers, that they can shoot the planes down at the 25 feet high, and that's why the US stopped any American airplane or aircraft flying over Venezuelan space, because they said that we're going to shut it down. And more than that, if you go to 2017, there was a hearing, and during the hearing in Congress between Mr. Pompeo, when he was the director of the CIA, and Mr. Rubio again, and they went into manpads, these rocket launchers, personal rocket launchers, and they said Venezuela is very dangerous because they have these rocket launchers, and they can spill over all these rocket launchers in the region, and we need to stop them right now, because they are the biggest threat in the region. And in Brazil, Eduardo Bolsonaro, the son of Mr. Bolsonaro, the president, with apparently it's worse than his father, he went to the Superior School of War, and he delivered a speech there saying that Venezuela is the main threat in the continent because of the manpads again. And the Brazilian military needs to prepare for a war against Venezuela because of these kind of weapons. So some Brazilians, journalists in Switzerland, they live in Switzerland, they ask, are you preparing Gulf of Tonkin case when some planes are going to be shut down and you're going to blame Venezuela? I am telling everyone at the Security Council exactly that. Be careful, because they're preparing the case that any plane that gets shut down in the region is going to be because Venezuela trained ELN people with these kind of weapons, and we are the culprits, the one to blame, you see? So be careful, because we don't know when they have these kind of resources prepared. I mean, they are preparing this stage, and then at any time they can come up with this dynamic event, they call it, that it will provoke the moral indignation in Congress to allow Congress to vote for war in Venezuela, as they just did in Iran. I mean, they blew some ships there, and even the owner of the ship says that He didn't know how it happened, but they already knew, and they put some grave films that some Iranians were doing it, and they blame Iran. The idea is they were looking for a case for war. And even though in Venezuela, the case for war is looking seemingly farther than it was 2 or 3 months ago, they are so desperate. People like Mr. Bolton are so desperate, they really want to have a war in Venezuela. And if they don't go directly with American boots on the ground, they will go by proxy war with people like, countries like Colombia, which are willing to go to war because they are already at war. My point is, the war with Venezuela would be an extension of the war within Colombia. And if you talk to these ultra far extremist right wing, I mean, these people are so far out. If you talk to this, you listen, I don't talk to them, but I listen to them attentively every day. And their speech goes like this, their ideas, that the war in Colombia is not against Colombians, it's against communism. And communism in Colombia will survive as long as Venezuela and Venezuelan communists are there. And you need to go to the root of the problem, and you need to unroot these Venezuelan communists to get rid of Colombian communists. It's an ideological war in the whole continent. This is the troika of tyranny, you see. Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela, you need to take them out in that precise order: Venezuela, Nicaragua, and then Cuba. So it's an ideological war. It's a project beyond any. It's complicated because how can you deal with people like that? How can you talk to people like that? How can you negotiate or have any kind of agreement? And this Mr. Bolton and Mr. Pompeo are pushing for war. And I've been in government before, and let me just say this, perhaps it's an indiscretion, but one of the roles of ministers and high senior officials is to pay for the mistakes of your boss, okay? So Mr. Trump has just to blame Bolton and Pompeo for what happened in Venezuela, but he was the one who was pushing for it. You see, the ones who pushed to regime change in Venezuela was Trump. The one who first offered war or all the options on the table in Venezuela was Trump. And he chose Bolton because Bolton wanted to do it. And he fired McMaster as the other ones because they didn't want to do it. So my point is that Mr. Trump is the dangerous one. If we believe that changing Bolton and putting someone else, Mr. Trump is going to change his mind, we are deluding ourselves. Sanctions, or technically we call them at the UN, unilateral coercive measures, are illegal. Sanctions are criminal. Sanctions violate human rights, and because they punish collectively the whole Venezuelan population. They don't discriminate between Chavistas or opposition people. Everybody is suffering there. People with diabetes, they need their insulin and they are not getting it, and sanctions don't mind who you support to or who you are against to. My point is that right now in this kind of war we are under, because sanctions are part of this spectrum, I am telling you, it's a fluid situation. Some people and countries, entire countries, are pushing towards war because they are desperate. They were defeated the 23rd of February, they were defeated the 30th of April, and every time, remember this, the 21st of February, with the Colombian border incident, when they tried to push violence into Venezuelan territory, Mr. Guaido asked directly to Mike Pence and the rest, please use force. And they were the ones who said, no, not yet. And then after the 30th of April, the failed coup d'etat, he went again saying, please use force. And now even Abrams yesterday said, the ones who decide the use of force is Trump, not Guaido. But what I mean is that these Venezuelan lackeys, they are asking for war for a long time ago. It's not that they are still thinking. The ones who are thinking properly and deciding when are the leaders in Washington, the real bosses of the whole thing. So we are in a very dangerous situation. We are in the middle of the struggle. I am proud, as you said, of our people who under so much suffering are still holding on. But I mean, we are in a situation as we had never been in more than 100 years, literally. Literally, never. Even I studied even the Venezuelan society during the Second World War, when we had a lot of shortages because of the war, precisely. But we are not at war. But the Venezuelans suffer there. Not even there, we are under such a stressful situation as now. So my point is that this struggle needs to be won with diplomacy, the four fronts that you said. Diplomacy, economic changes and fighting sanctions, being agile and flexible enough to avoid or try at least to reduce, alleviate should be the right word, alleviate the impact of sanctions in Venezuela, being creative in producing new ways of fulfilling our needs, and the new kind of economy, being much more flexible. The economy we had 5 years ago, it doesn't work now. I mean, it's ridiculous. You said it yourself. It's a dollarization in practice, in the factual dollarization of the economy. And we need to open the ports. We need to be much more flexible with people trying to create their own conditions and their own economy and their own way to cope would be the right word here, with the situation. But we are in an emergency, and we need to react to that. The media is another thing. I mean, people believe that we are eating each other there, and it's not like that. We are suffering, but we are not even more. Perhaps I read this yesterday, and I was doubting if I can use it properly, because there is a UNDP report on Latin America, and they said that there are 14 countries in Latin America with a worse economic performance than Venezuela right now. 14. Yeah. But nobody speaks of them. Look at Honduras, what's going on right now. Look at Haiti. Look at Guatemala. Why they are migrating to the United States? Look how they are being treated here at the border. I mean, my point is that the situation, I don't want to tell you that the situation is good at all. I mean, it's not even normal, or it's really, really nasty. But it's not the worst situation in the continent. And the media situation is portraying that R2P means in UN parlance, responsibility to protect. It's a kind of notion or doctrine that allows other powers to intervene in other countries if they are going to save the population of that particular country against the will of its own government, their own government. Cases like Somalia, or South Sudan, or they claim R2P in Syria. But my point is that they are saying we have the right to intervene for humanitarian reasons. They are trying to build an R2P case in Venezuela. That all this suffering they are provoking the suffering, but the causes are being ignored. They're saying it's Maduro's regime. We need to change Maduro. And that's what they keep saying. Change Maduro and things are going to improve. But that's what they say to the head of the intelligence services who deserted a month ago. The man is in Washington right now, we read yesterday, and the man now is being celebrated as a hero of democracy, hero of freedom, and the sanctions, personal sanctions against him have been lifted. And now the man is shown around as an example for Venezuelan officers and military personnel to follow that particular example. So you see how sanctions and these kind of manipulations are being built in order to provoke an implosion in Venezuela. The fourth, I said the economic, I said the media, and the diplomatic. And the fourth is the most important in the sense that the most dangerous. We need to work for peace. I mean, we need to avoid war. The anti-war movement here is very important. That's why I listened so attentively to your idea. I never heard that before, of the municipal or city decisions, or what is called the resolutions. I thought that resolutions were just in the General Assembly. Resolutions, brilliant. Resolutions of city resolution, or city council, or city hall's resolution, pushing for exactly that, asking Congress to approve the use of force in Venezuela first, in case that they treat. Mr. Trump said yesterday that he doesn't need any approval from any Congress if he takes military action against any country. Even, in fact, I read that, because I need to read about these things, there is a book called War Presidents. American war president, but it's called war president, and it's the study of all presidents who have started or been part of war in the United States, and few of them asked Congress. You see? Roosevelt, Second World War, but the rest they didn't mind. They went in and then Congress followed. My point is that this danger, people who believe that Congress is going to stop Trump from getting into a war, they are deluding themselves. But they need to work in that direction. They need to warn people that they are stumbling towards war, or even more, sleepwalking towards war. And all of you have been pushed toward a war that none of you want. And we, no, of course, we don't want that war either. But my point is, how can we work together to stop that war? But mind you, we are at war already, this kind of sanctions. And how can we stop them as well? Because they are driving us towards implosion and facilitating the R2P, the humanitarian intervention, which means a multinational force led by the United States or supported by the United States to invade Venezuela, and that would be a disaster for the next 5 generations. We need to stop that, and this is a very noble mission. Thank you very much.